Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Enablement Brew podcast. I'm Carly Lehner.
And I'm Melvina Alsayak, and we're so excited you're joining us. And today we have a guest. Carly, do you want to introduce our guest?
Yes, a very exciting guest. So we have Ted McKenna here, who is actually one of the co-authors of the new book, The Jolt Effect. Well, it's actually not, it's still pretty new. It's less than a year,
7
right?
months, yeah, it is. Yep.
Yeah, so we can say it's still new. So Ted is here, and we're going to talk all about the Jolt Effect. But before we kind of dive in, I actually have a really great story about this. So I was just telling my husband a couple minutes ago, I was like, oh yeah, I'm recording an episode with Ted McKenna, who's author of Jolt Effect. And he's like, no way. My friend Nick brought the book, The Jolt Effect, on their lads trip to Madrid last week.
Gosh.
So he's like, it was on his nightstand. So it's just kind of funny full circle that like it is a very prominent book in sales. And so yeah, it was kind of a small world moment. So,
who knew we'd make it into a guy's trip? That never would have expected that to be on
the lads trip. But Ted, before we dive in into like introductions and all of that, we always open every episode with what's in your mug. So what are you drinking this morning?
Well, I'm a pretty simple guy, just black coffee. This is a Keurig, breakfast blend of some sort. So who knows what the heck they put in those packets? I can't tell you exactly if that's the freshest coffee out there in the world, but it's quick and convenient.
Is that instant? Are we talking instant?
No, it's the Keurig packet thing. So it's the little machine, and yep.
Malvina's an instant gal, so
okay.
Like she even goes.
I feel like I lose so many brownie points by now, since everyone knows now I'm an instant. It's like, oh, she doesn't drink real coffee.
Well, I was feeling a little embarrassed by saying the Keurig, but now I feel actually pretty good relative.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So it's instant coffee. Okay. Over to you, Carly.
I like that mug though. I got a new mug. I'm super excited about it. But I'm drinking tea, and it's actually like a fruit kind of tea, which is not something I drink very often, but I have a friend who went to Japan and brought back some like really lovely fruit teas. I don't think there's caffeine in it. So for me, I typically am like, what's the point if there's no caffeine?
Exactly.
But I figured I'd give it a try today. So, but yeah, so Ted, we're super excited to have you. So tell us a little bit about like your background, because I know, because you and I have worked together for a bit, like you have more of like this research background, and I think that's super interesting, especially like with the sales lens. So like tell us a bit about how you got to work.
Yeah, I was mostly a researcher by trade, with some stints in product and advisory. Matt Dixon, my co-author, and I both kind of grew up professionally in a company called CEB, or Corporate Executive Board. They're now owned by Gartner. And sort of a best practices research organization of all types of sort of corporate practices, whether it's HR, finance, tech, and I just happen to be in the sales and marketing practice, which for me has always been kind of the most interesting part of business. Is how do you create demand out of thin air? How do you get, especially I did a small stint right at the beginning on the marketing council. So this was doing research for heads of marketing and then later heads of sales and sales operations, which I'll get to here in a moment. And I did a little bit of the business to consumer side, but I've always found the business to business side more interesting. When people are spending other people's money, what gets them to, it's not my money, it's my company's money, but I have, of course, lots of opinions as to how we should spend that budget. And the whole just process of a salesperson finding ways to establish value and win their fair share of those dollars has been really, really interesting to me. So I spent 10 years essentially doing research there, and ended up doing a mix of kind of advisory. So for CEB is sort of, that's the part of the company that would teach the research rather than create the research. And that sort of took me into the Challenger sale days for the audience that might know the Challenger. So I was kind of running the mid-market sales business for them at the time that Challenger came out. And as you might expect, that had a whole momentum of its own, lots and lots and lots of interest from our members on how do we roll out Challenger? How do we think about creating more Challengers within our organization? And so that was kind of a fun ride. I actually started the sales journey for me was in sales operations. We started a council called the Sales Operations Excellence Center, and this was 2006. So it was right around the time when that function was kind of formalizing, which kind of sounds funny because it feels like people in sales enablement are still talking about the idea of formalizing and sort of what is our identity, and and I feel like sales operations has kind of morphed into what is now considered to be sales enablement. But that was just studying the people whose job it was to sales process, metrics, communications, compensation, kind of the nuts and bolts of running the sales organization. And so I spent a couple of years there before I then transitioned into broader kind of sales strategy type stuff. So that's kind of how I started, and I then did a stint in professional services, kind of doing some of the things we were researching from a sales enablement, content marketing, insight generation perspective, and then followed Matt to another company called Tether, which is a machine learning company, which brings us to Jolt. And so machine learning it's a piece of software that allows, in that case, to understand unstructured conversations. So what's going on between seller and buyer, or between customer and company after they've bought something and had a problem. And so I was in a sort of mix of product and research roles for Tether. And the last year we were there, we did this big study on sales, which ended up being the Jolt Effect.
Love it. Ted, I'm going to say something because before we said we never really officially met, but I have your book and it's actually been signed by you.
Oh,
there it is.
Wow.
Hold on. This camera.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's
we'll take
it's
your
here.
word for it. I think I saw a little glimpse.
There it is.
There it is. That's you, right?
That is me. Yes.
It's an authentic copy.
I mean, I have a team of ghost signers out there in the world, but that one I can tell you is definitely me.
Yay! Amazing. I love this book, and I think it's so relevant in today's climate. Everyone talks about sales being extremely difficult, extremely challenging. Buyers are more picky. They're more confused than ever. And one of the themes in the book is this idea of being the buyer's agent.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that resonates? First of all, what is it? And why do you think it resonates so much in the current climate where everyone is saying it's just so difficult? It's so difficult to hit our targets. It's so difficult to get someone to say yes.
Yeah. I mean, so the premise of one of the main premises of the book is that we lose more often than we think, and it's not for the reasons that we might expect. So we've all been sort of trained and taught that the only way that somebody might decide to do nothing at all is because they're not willing to put aside their sort of grasp with the status quo. And so they just want to keep doing what they're doing. But we found all these instances in the study, and then studied psychology and behavioral economics to understand why this was. But we found all these instances in the study where it felt like the buyer had clear intent to purchase. They wanted to buy, felt like they needed to buy, and yet still were sort of stuck. And in those cases, the salesperson has their sales hat on, and their job, they feel like, is to persuade and influence and build demand, which makes total sense until it doesn't. When that buyer, the problem they're trying to solve for there is not make them want it more, make them feel like they need it more. That can be an effective tactic, but there are lots of times when you're over that hill and they're still stuck with indecision. And that's where that buyer's agent starts to become much more effective, where it's less a job of influence and persuasion and more a job of making them confident that they've made the right decision, that they're not going to mess up, that we've got your back, and that there's protection here. And part of that is, making sure you're operating with full transparency. They feel like you've got their best interest in mind. And sort of the opposite of what I think buyers often feel, which is, I'm worried I'm going to overbuy or overpurchase, because who among us has not done that before, whether it's buying something personally or something as part of our business. And so that was sort of the genesis of the buyer's agent. Is it's sort of akin to needing a travel agent or a travel advisor on the personal side. I need somebody to help kind of guide me here, help me feel more confident that this choice over that choice, they both seem right. Like, do I go to Florence or Rome? I don't know. They're both great cities. So I need somebody to help me understand you're not going to be disappointed with this decision. So that's kind of where the buyer's agent really comes into play.
So Ted, we've actually have been talking about this like trust in sales concept for a couple episodes now. So we had Andrew Sykes on from Habits at Work,
Hmm.
and he's on a mission to make sales like one of the most trusted professions. And one of the topics we talked about is can a buyer really trust a salesperson when they might be getting a commission? Like there's, the various motivations of a salesperson. So how do you see like being a buyer agent
Yeah.
and building trust in sales? Like those are, it seems like two really important things, but how do we
Yeah.
get to that point?
I think it could be really difficult on a couple of different fronts. I mean, for one, the buyer, you walk in the door and the buyer already distrusts you, and it's not your fault. It's just based on the history of them purchasing things and everyone feeling as if, yeah, that person is commission based or incentive based. And of course, they're going to want to try and sell me the biggest possible thing. And so their guard is already up, and you're starting from not zero, but behind zero, right from the get-go. I think on top of that, there's also times when the buyer kind of goads you into that trap in some respects because they're super excited about the purchase and they want to kind of push super hard, even harder or faster than they're going to be ready for. So you hear buyers who get excited about transformation. We're going to transform our company. We're going to, and they think that single purchase is going to change so much. And they start to get their expectations outside for what's actually practical. And so, but if you're the seller, of course, that's pretty tempting, right? Like they're so excited, it's like, this is amazing. They've got so much budget. Everything's moving. Like this is going to be the biggest deal I've ever sold. It can be really difficult emotionally even to just tap the brakes and say, wait, is this actually ever going to happen? Like, can they actually do this? And is this right for them? I think the other thing is, product leaders, company leaders can play a role in this too. I mean, especially, I think this is true in technology-based settings. There are nuanced ways in which you can create or extend distrust into the conversation. Like for instance, when you have a roadmap item, a product roadmap item that's not quite ready for prime time, like it's being tested, it won't be ready for 6 months, for 12 months, but you're using it as a way to attract interest. Like this is the vanguard of our technology. This is the reason this is so exciting to work with us and not with them. It's very easy to kind of position that in a way that feels like it's actually ready. And so you can imagine then when it's not, it creates some sort of purchase regret right from the get-go, which creates follow-on issues for customer success. So it's a complex issue for sure. And I think the rule of thumb is try to operate as much as possible with honesty and transparency and be clear-eyed about the expectations that you're setting with the buyer, and start from there and kind of go from there. But it is a complex issue.
You raised really good points, because I've been in situations like this where I potentially brought on a product or a service. It's in the roadmap, it's coming within the next 2 weeks, we end up signing. A month goes by. Where is this really critical feature that
right.
promised we're going to have?
They demoed it for me.
Yeah.
And then I have to say, it really sours the entire relationship. And however amazing and incredible the sales process was, or the journey that I've had and the experience that I've had as I was making that decision, almost everything gets canceled out, because all I remember is you promised this thing and you didn't deliver on it. And now I'm being asked questions as to why we can't do this particular thing that we needed to do.
I think the other, totally. And I think it's very easy for a salesperson to act as if their product is super easy to use, right? And even though that there are some hiccups that happen often, in onboarding phase or installation phase or whatever the product is, and you want to sell this sort of out of the box experience. This is going to be so easy. You're going to be, but you can earn a lot of credit by being honest about, hey, this is going to take X number of months and this is going to take a little bit of time. It's going to take a little bit of effort. At least then you go in, eyes wide open as to what that is. And to your point, you're not then wondering this is now a full-time job to implement this solution that they told me is an out of the box, setup. And so, yeah, again, expectation setting, I think, are really important.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things, I don't remember the stat now, but the power of making a recommendation, right? There's so many different competing products out there. If you're after a particular product or service, you can go to competitor A, B, C, D. The differences between each will be quite marginal, but the choice is there. And when you're making that buying decision, you're like, well, should I go for them? They have really good reviews. And I heard, Carly uses this particular product. Should I go with Carly's opinion because I trust Carly? But then someone else within the organization says, look at this particular product. And very suddenly we need to solve, a particular challenge. We need a product that addresses X, Y, and Z. It actually like grows in proportion to what it started. One of the premises of the book is the power of making a recommendation, and sellers who do that are actually far more successful. But how do you make a recommendation when, yes, you want that particular customer to purchase your product? You also want to be as neutral as possible, right? To be able to show that you have the buyer's best interest at heart.
Yep.
But it sounds conflicting because on one hand, you want to give them that guidance, but saying to someone, you know what, we can't do 100% what you're asking for right now. That product that I told you that I promised in the roadmap, actually, it's probably not going to happen for another 6 months.
Yeah.
That becomes very conflicting.
Totally. I think so. There's also nuance in sort of how you offer that recommendation and when you offer that recommendation. You do to the point Carly made about trust earning. It is kind of trust building in situations where you give a competitor credit for certain situations. Like if that is the main capability that you're looking for, this other provider does this really well. You of course want to couch that and contextualize that within, the context of what can we do better, what's the reason why, and what might you be sacrificing if you were to go that route. I would be careful about making a distinction between the process of getting a buyer to care enough to purchase, that they have intent to purchase. There's a difference between indifference and indecision. And so in the situation where they're still indifferent about, should I buy from you or should I buy from this other company? There's a whole slew of methodologies that help to get to that point. And that's more about differentiation, So how do I get them to care about my problem more than their problem and do so in a way that leads back to me as the unique provider? It's a really, really important part of the process, but not necessarily tied to indecision itself. And recommendations, so you guys are probably familiar with the challenger sale work. I mean, there are elements of teaching, and sort of leading to me as unique provider that is somewhat of a recommendation in the sense that you're helping them understand and appreciate a problem and the depth of it in a way that, sort of on its own is a path or a roadmap to this solution, not that solution. But to your point, done so in a way that feels like it's a little bit more neutral. In the book, we talk about the power of indecision. So once you've already decided you want to purchase, within that set, then there's still a whole bunch of considerations about the features that I want, the contract length I'm going to get, how I might look to roll it out. And that in and of itself can be paralyzing. And that's where I think the recommendation can be extra powerful in sort of getting them over the hump in those situations. Which option is it, this one or is that one, in a world where they both kind of look right. The last thing I'll say about recommendation, though, and I think this speaks more to the emotion that we've hit on already on both the seller and the buyer side, is from the seller perspective, I think it can be difficult to overcome the instinct to defer to the buyer. Far be it from me to tell you what your needs are and what you should be doing. You called me, you're the one that told me you wanted. So let's go back to the reason you started down this path and use that as the inspiration rather than me telling you what I think you should do. And so that's where I think it can be really sort of a powerful moment for a coach or for a manager to counteract those instincts, to say, look, there's a time and a place to ask, and then there's a time and a place to tell. And when you tell in these situations, it has the effect from the buyer perspective of relief. Thank God, finally, like I can shift a little bit of the blame that I'm worried about messing up from me to them. They told me what to do. It's not my decision in some ways.
Yeah. One of the things that I really liked in the book was the concept of FUD. So reducing the fear, uncertainty, and doubt of like the indecision. And, there's varying degrees of that. And so I'm actually just really curious, like as a researcher, you were sitting on all of this data, but then you guys had to conceptualize it and build a story and like a concept around it. So how do you reach like coming up with like FUD, for example, as
Yeah.
like a way to deliver the information.
Yeah, and especially so we were studying conversations. We studied 2.5 million sales conversations, and that's a lot of unstructured data.
Yeah.
As a researcher, that alone presents interesting challenges because while there's tons of opportunity, it's also a lot more complex than if you have, a structured survey, for instance, with a set of, answers within a given set of survey questions. One of the first things we saw when we looked at the data was a lot more losses than we expected, even in situations when it felt like the buyer was fully intending to purchase. And so that kind of put us, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of put us down the path of indecision. And more importantly, how does the salesperson handle those moments? What are they doing when it feels like the buyer is like, I'm not sure what to do. I know I should do something, but I don't know what to do. And that's where we saw a lot of what we call the sort of the FOMO play in those attempts. FUD is an example. It's not the only one, but it's an example of what a seller might do to raise FOMO with that buyer. So the fear of missing out. So you use FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, as a way to help the buyer see all the things they're going to miss out on if they don't move forward. You're going to miss out on solving this big problem. You're going to miss out on all these big benefits and these big ROI returns. You're going to miss out on the gains your competitors are going to make. There's lots of ways you can miss out, and I might use fear basically to scare them into and try to motivate them to buy. Look at all the pain that you're going to experience. This thing isn't going to solve itself. Your team hates it. Your customers hate you. There's all sorts of ways in which I can draw up that pain to try to motivate that purchase. And what we found in our study for that highly indecisive buyer is that actually backfires. So it's not even just that it's not effective. It's actually 84% of the time it backfires and makes things worse, not better. You'd be better off doing nothing at all. And so that FUD tactic can be a very powerful tool, particularly when you're trying to persuade and you're trying to help them understand why change now is necessary. But it can backfire if you overuse it in these situations when the problem is not they worry about missing out, but rather they fear messing up. So that's the FOMO acronym that kind of comes into play there. So you're trying to overcome that fear of messing up. FUD actually is probably the worst thing you could do in those situations. The buyer's already fearful. They're already scared. So throwing more fear on top of that, you can imagine, only exacerbates that problem.
Yeah.
What's your advice then to sales managers and potentially even AEs when it comes to, we're talking about FUD, we're talking about indecision, we're talking about FOMO, but we're also talking about fear of messing up, which is quite prevalent these days. What's your advice to sales managers and AEs that last week of the quarter, when you have that hustle of let's close it, and suddenly everyone's on the phone, everyone's typing out emails, offering, a discount, or saying, we'll offer you this discount if you sign by end of today. That puts a lot of pressure on the buyer. And we've seen instances, Carly, I'm sure you've seen instances where actually that backfires and it's like, oh, it actually got pushed to next quarter because they're not quite ready yet.
Yeah.
What's your advice to them when they have that pressure of closing out the month or closing out the quarter?
Yeah. Look, it's the reality of the situation. Work in a sales organization, you do have, a incentive-based plan, and undoubtedly you've got quarter goals and year-end goals. And, there's going to come a time late in that quarter or late in that month or late in that year when the sales leader is looking to, close out as much business as possible. And you start throwing around discounts or other sort of urgency drivers. We talk about these like the 10% discount is kind of one of the main plays that you kind of run out there. And it's so transparent to both the buyer and the seller. If you're the buyer, why don't you just wait until they throw it out there? Because they're probably going to in some ways. But we kind of keep doing it because it is a play that we think at that time. I think there's a couple of lessons to keep in mind there. Look, sometimes the discount does work and you can get them across the line. In those cases, it probably wasn't the discount that got them across the line. There's probably other dynamics involved, disappearing budget, or maybe they have latent concerns, but for whatever reason, internal politics, timing being what it is, somebody on the team pushing for it, they still push through. The important thing to remember, though, is that doesn't mean the indecision went away. So just because you got them across the line with that discount, it can linger within even in a win in those situations. And all that does is create downstream issues for the rest of the organization, who now has to serve that account, who has to renew that potential account, who has to deal with all the regret that that buyer might feel, from the minute that they've hit go on that purchase. And so if you're going to use discounts in that period of time, I think I would just be careful about balancing that with making sure you're addressing that fear of messing up at the same time. So giving them a safety net of some sort, giving them some protection on that decision, helping them understand what the road to value is going to be, and that you're going to get off to a fast start. The last thing I'll say, though, is that, look, I know this is an obvious thing to say, but all things equal, you'd rather not get to that situation where you have to throw the discount out there. And if you're at that late point and you don't know if there's indecision, like if it's indecision or if it's indifference, you missed a bunch of signals early on. So there's lots of things you could have done along the way to both understand the depth of indecision and to treat that indecision. And then hopefully, because of that, they've already made the decision and you're not waiting until the end of the quarter. Lots of things go into how to do that. And we talk about that in the book. And I know it's kind of an obvious thing, solve it early. But that there's a reason why that buyer's not yet purchased, and it's not just because they're not willing to buy or that they don't want to buy. Often it's because they're stuck in indecision. So addressing that might actually prevent that situation where they seem to be kicking the can down the road and they're waiting until next quarter. And so solving for indecision earlier can help with that.
So Ted, it would be lovely for a rep to read the book and be like a master at this, right? But there's practice and skill like that has to like really go into like truly mastering this. So can you tell us a little bit about DCM insights and kind of what you guys are doing off of the back of Jolt Effect?
Sure. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. Some of the things in the book, I think people will find to be, quite tactical and easy to try from the beginning, making a recommendation, setting expectations, probably two of the most prominent ones. And there are other things that are good. There are going to take a little bit of practice, a little reflection, a little skill building to kind of get there. Even after you know conceptually what it is, giving yourself opportunity and time to practice those things, just like any skill, is going to be necessary. So DCM Insights, and you can find also on jolteffect.com. So DCM Insights, we're a research company. So we spend, just like this conversation, all of our time looking at buyer data, buyer experiences, extrapolating what that means for sellers and salespeople. For the Jolt Effect, what we did was we built out a whole self-guided course. It's like a 10-hour set of curriculum that people can absorb and understand and learn more tactically. What does this mean? It expands actually on the concepts in the book pretty considerably. So as we started to dive back into the research and understand, what does it actually mean to judge the level of indecision? How does this play into how we think about qualifying and forecasting opportunities? As people go to tactically like get better at, not just make a recommendation, but how do you get better at making a recommendation? What's good, better, best look like when you go to offer proactive guidance? So you get down to very sort of specific guidance, tools, tactics, things that are kind of in that course. Now, as you might imagine, that's an asynchronous self-guided course. So there are a series of organizations that have asked us to get involved, especially early stage as they kind of get things started with the team, whether that's speaking at the sales kickoff to get people coalescing around some of the key themes, or even kind of extending that into a couple of workshops to get the sort of team's hands dirty on around some exercises and group thinking on some of those things. And then they can use the course as a way to kind of get through to full certification. So it's a little flexible on that front, but it was built for those people that have the desire to go on to jolteffect.com to get their certification, get the LinkedIn badge, which I had no idea the LinkedIn badge was as big a deal, I guess, as it is. But evidently people love the LinkedIn badge.
I love that. We're going to have so many enablement leaders now going online and be like, oh, this sounds exciting. And everyone can get a LinkedIn badge. That's the extra brownie, right?
the whole gamification, like it comes to life on LinkedIn, and it's becoming such like a prominent platform for your career that you want to like, it's like when you were like in the Girl Scouts or something, you had all like your badges on your vest. Like LinkedIn is kind of the same thing. If you can have all these badges to show what you're good at, like cool.
For
So
sure.
yeah, great job leaning into that.
Well, I'll give Carly credit. So Carly was early adopter, if you will, of sort of the Jolt effect, and so she gave us really good advice and counsel as we were sort of building that out. And one of the things that we evolved and sort of changed with that rollout period was adding a little bit more support for those managers and for those coaches in that process. So for those people who are going through the course, the managers also have access to a series of kind of rollout support, coaching tools. This actually pretty interesting. This is podcast series and season that we built that is aimed specifically at leaders and managers who are going to be walking with those reps on the learning journey. So what are the unique challenges you as leaders will have as your team is grappling with, oh, now I have to go and limit the exploration in this way. Like, what are the things they're going to be worried about? What are the traps they're going to fall into? What are the ways you can be working with your team and coaching them in those settings? So we tried our best to kind of surround it as much as possible with as much sort of enablement and sort of development support as possible, knowing that these things don't happen in a vacuum. People are helping the sales team as they kind of go down that journey.
Yeah. Do you have plans to write a book particularly relating to the challenges of enablement in today's climate?
Well, I'd love to hear some thoughts from you all as to what you think those unique challenges are today. There's the researcher in me flipping it around and interviewing you all on those challenges. We tried to speak to some of the enablement challenges themselves with respect to helping teams overcome indecision. Those are sort of the back chapters of the book. So there's a chapter on coaching and training. There's a chapter on assessing this type of behavior and what that might involve. But there's no plans right now to have a full book directly on enablement issues. We always like to kind of start with buyers and with what's going on from a purchasing perspective and work back from there. But I know it's been a very interesting last, call it 6 to 9 months in the enablement community itself. And we could probably talk for days about, the ways in which, behavior measurements are changing and process is changing. Technology, of course, is a very sort of, the tech stack in sales these days is probably just massive. So even just managing that is creating sort of unique circumstances. But maybe that's a long way of saying that I don't know the answer to your question yet, but if you think there's some specific burning issue, we'd love to hear it.
I think it's twofold as well. We talk about making the decision, the actual purchasing decision. I think a lot of the challenges also for enablement are great. We brought on board this amazing tool. Now, how do we get the adoption and the usage?
Yeah. Well, and each incremental tool just adds to that challenge, at the same time. Going back to when sales ops, 2006, that was one of our first studies was CRM adoption. Like how do you, and yet we're still, almost 20 years later talking about CRM adoption. But I think it's just because, of course it's a very complex thing and, getting busy people to give input data into a system that maybe doesn't give them all that much value is always going to be difficult. But I think when you add a dozen more tools that they could be using on any given day, it just creates a lot of, noise for them on a day-to-day basis. So that's, I imagine that's a pretty burning issue, I imagine, for people like yourselves in terms of just helping people use the things that you just spent a bunch of money and time figuring out what to buy.
Yeah. There's definitely a point of diminishing returns with your tech stack. And like, that's a question I'm asking myself like every day at this point. Like, are we just doing more harm than good? Even though like this might be amazing, it's not going to be amazing if we don't actually adopt it. And so that will ultimately save us money. But anyway, that could probably be a whole other episode topic. But Ted, thank you so much for joining us. I thought this was a super interesting conversation. I love hearing like the research side of what goes into like the Jolt Effect or Challenger sale, like the amount of calls you guys had to analyze and like look at the data and then come up with the point of view, I think is just always super interesting to hear. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to do it. I'm a big research nerd. So if you want to talk research again, let's run it back. We'll do it again.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in for another episode of the Enablement Brew podcast, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in. Bye.
Thanks all.